Avoidance and breadcrumbing, why they do it and what it really means. There is one behavior that leaves people emotionally confused, emotionally attached, and emotionally exhausted more than almost anything else in modern relationships, and that behavior is called breadcrumbing. Because one moment, the avoidant seems distant, emotionally unavailable, and completely disconnected from you. But then suddenly, they send a small message, react to your story, check in out of nowhere, or give you just enough attention to pull you back emotionally again. Not enough to build a real relationship. Not enough to create consistency or emotional safety. But just enough to keep the emotional connection from fully dying. And this is exactly why breadcrumbing feels so psychologically confusing and emotionally addictive. Because it creates hope without real stability. It creates emotional attachment without emotional security. And it keeps you emotionally invested in something that never fully moves forward. What makes this even more painful is that many avoidants do not always breadcrumb in a consciously evil or manipulative way. Sometimes they genuinely care about you on some emotional level. Sometimes they miss you, think about you, or feel emotionally connected to you in moments of loneliness or emotional vulnerability. But the problem is this. Their fear of emotional closeness often becomes stronger than their desire for real intimacy. So they send small emotional signals instead of fully showing up consistently. They give pieces of connection instead of true emotional presence. And over time, this creates an emotionally exhausting cycle for the other person. One day, they pull you close emotionally. The next day, they disappear emotionally again without explanation. One week, they act affectionate and emotionally warm. The next week, they become cold, distant, and difficult to reach. This inconsistency is not random. It usually comes from the internal conflict that exists inside avoidant attachment itself. Avoidants often crave connection deeply underneath the surface. But at the same time, emotional closeness can trigger fear, pressure, vulnerability, or loss of control inside them. So they constantly move back and forth between wanting intimacy and wanting distance. And breadcrumbing becomes the perfect middle ground for that internal conflict, because it allows them to maintain emotional access to you without fully committing to emotional responsibility. They get connection without too much vulnerability. They get emotional reassurance without complete emotional exposure. They get comfort without feeling fully trapped by intimacy. This is why breadcrumbing can feel incredibly confusing for the person receiving it, because the avoidance behavior often sends mixed emotional messages that constantly contradict each other. Their words may sound caring and emotionally interested, but their actions remain inconsistent, distant, or emotionally unavailable. And this creates emotional confusion inside the other person, because hope keeps getting reactivated over and over again. You start telling yourself things like, maybe they really do care about me. Maybe they're just scared. Maybe they'll finally open up if I stay patient. And sometimes, those thoughts are partially true. Many avoidants are scared of emotional vulnerability and intimacy. But fear alone does not build healthy relationships. Consistency, accountability, emotional communication, and effort are what create emotional safety over time. And breadcrumbing usually lacks all of those things. One of the hardest truths to accept is this. Someone can miss you emotionally and still be incapable of giving you the relationship you actually need. That realization hurts deeply because many people confuse emotional signs with emotional readiness. But they are not always the same thing. An avoidant may genuinely think about you every single day. They may feel emotional attachment toward you. They may even feel pain when losing you completely. But if they have not confronted their own emotional patterns, fears, and avoidance behaviors, they may continue repeating the same cycle again and again. And this is where breadcrumbing becomes dangerous emotionally, because it keeps people emotionally attached to potential instead of reality. You become emotionally connected to who they could become someday, instead of fully seeing who they consistently are right now. And over time, this can slowly damage your emotional well-being, because you begin surviving on emotional crumbs instead of receiving genuine emotional consistency. You start overanalyzing every message they send. You start feeling excited over tiny amounts of attention. You start attaching deep emotional meaning to small interactions because inconsistency has trained your nervous system to crave unpredictability. This creates an emotional roller coaster that becomes exhausting mentally and emotionally. The highs feel intense because they are rare, and the lows feel painful because emotional distance suddenly returns without warning. The hardest part is that breadcrumbing often keeps closure from happening completely, because every small interaction reopens emotional hope again. Just when you begin emotionally detaching and healing, another small message pulls your emotions backward. And this keeps many people emotionally stuck for months or even years. Now, this does not mean every avoidant person is intentionally manipulative or malicious. Some are deeply unaware of the emotional impact their inconsistency creates. Some genuinely struggle with emotional intimacy, vulnerability, and fear of dependency. But regardless of intention, the emotional effect on the other person can still become deeply painful. Because emotional inconsistency creates anxiety, confusion, self-doubt, and emotional instability in relationships. And eventually, you reach a point where you must ask yourself an important question. Are you building a real relationship with this person, or are you surviving emotionally on temporary moments of connection? Because real love does not survive on crumbs alone. Real love requires consistency, emotional presence, communication, and emotional accountability. It requires someone who is willing to stay emotionally present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Not someone who only appears when they feel lonely, nostalgic, emotionally triggered, or afraid of losing access to you completely. And this is the deeper meaning behind avoidant breadcrumbing. It often reveals emotional conflict inside the avoidant person, but it also reveals an emotional imbalance inside the relationship itself. One person keeps hoping for emotional depth and stability, while the other person keeps offering partial connection without full emotional availability. And eventually, you have to stop asking whether they care about you sometimes, and start asking whether their behavior is actually healthy for your emotional well-being long-term. Because being wanted occasionally is not the same thing as being loved consistently. And once you fully understand that difference, you begin seeing breadcrumbing for what it really is. Not a real relationship, but emotional access without emotional commitment. And remember this, someone giving you occasional attention is not the same thing as genuine emotional commitment. You deserve consistency, emotional safety, and a connection that does not leave you constantly confused. If this video helped you understand avoidant behavior more deeply, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, protect your peace and never settle for emotional crumbs.